This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel, and the Israel Institute, enhancing the study and knowledge of modern Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-hostess, Dalia Shenlin. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and other things that we find fascinating. Our guest today is Arie Dubnov. He's a professor of history and Israel studies at George Washington University. Together with Laura Robson, he's co-edited a book that has been freshly published called Partitions, a Transnational History of 20th-Century Territorial Separation, published by Stanford University Press. Arie Dubnov, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
It's especially nice to be able to talk about something that is so topical, both to the entire history of the last century and to right now. Tell us about partition. Is it really natural to humankind? People cannot live together. We are misanthropes. We hate each other. We just all have to get divorced all the time, and nations and states and everything must break up. Is that the case, or do you see it? Do you see it with any more complexity?
Well, of course, we all know the saying, right? Good fences make good neighbors. That's the assumption behind partition. I think that, before even trying to answer such a question, I think that part of the problem is that we all mean different things by the word partition. So sometimes we think about it as synonymous with divorce. Sometimes we see it as some sort of a form of what political scientists would call devolution of power, that you move the power from a central government to a smaller subnational or local branch. Sometimes most of the people that hear that I'm talking and writing about the subject assume that partition, they imagined a map. The first thing they had that comes to mind is kind of the drawing of a line on a map, which was also, to be honest, my initial thought. It took me a long time to realize that actually the line on the map was often the last thing that was done. So part of what we were trying to do in this kind of a collection of essays is really to understand the historical, what's specific about partitions. Our assumption or the big claim we're making is that it's definitely not natural. You do need a historian in the room because it's a quintessentially 20th century type of phenomena.
Okay. So there's my question. Isn't it just an extension, and not a very elaborate one, of the logic of the nation states, right? From the Treaty of Westphalia in the 17th century, Protestants go there, Catholics go here. We separate them. Good fences make good neighbors. Why is 20th century separation different?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. I think that the 20th century is fascinating and so complex due to some sort of an essential paradox we see in the global order as it comes to fruition after World War I. This is the so-called Wilsonian moment. And I call it an essential paradox because on the one hand, World War I, assumingly, this is how we were taught in high school, signified the end of empires. And in the cases of few very notable empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, that was their end. But
what happens when you declare the end of history? History always comes roaring back.
Absolutely.
To bite you in the bum.
And the empires that did survive this climatic event, namely the French colonial system and the British Empire, are bigger than ever before, right? Those of us that are familiar with these maps of post-World War I, the globe is full with more and more red and pinkish dots that signify the size of the empire. And in the British case, this is fascinating because you have this paradox that President Wilson comes in and says, empire is a bad word. That's a derogatory term. This is why we had this awful war. Now it's all about self-determination, and we need to move away from empire. But on the other hand, the empire is bigger than ever before. So you start developing very new, sophisticated ways of indirect imperialism, of indirect influence, or using a lot of things that make life very difficult for the history students. Mandates, dominions, co-dominions, a lot of new creatures that reappear in post-Paris 1919.
And since we're talking about this definition of partition and empires, on the empire point, it's very interesting that you use the term red dots, because there's another empire that, of course, arises in the 20th century, and that's the Soviet Empire, if we can say, with all of those imperialist kind of tactics. And so do you include that in your analysis?
That's a fascinating question. I mean, to make an important point, the Soviets see themselves as a federation. So we'll talk in a second about
this is one of my challenges to the claim,
Imperial Federation. And the basic assumption of our collection it's sort of this collective effort is to bring historians that can study the three paradigmatic, what we consider to be the three paradigmatic partitions in the 20th century, all of which are taking place under the bigger umbrella, namely the British Empire, namely Ireland, Palestine, and India-Pakistan. Our assumption is that it did grow out from a very specific, conditions of the early 1920s and 30s and the way the global order reformulated itself, and also a very specific British imperial infrastructure. And this is also why we thought it's important not simply to put them side by side. And this is where we're trying to do, that's a mouthful, a transnational history and connect the dots between these partitions and not simply put them side by side and do a comparative study. The similarities are well known. And the historians are well versed and trained in studying the local cases. What we try to do here is to say, how come we have this similarity?
So this is, just to elaborate on this point a bit more, you see partition as really an imperial exercise, predominantly British, that was just the inevitable outcome of a previous imperial exercise, which was divide and rule?
Well, whenever a historian hears the word inevitable, I reach to my gun, right? Nothing is inevitable. It's all about contingency. But I think that part of what makes partition extremely complicated to study is the fact that there's a big gap between the original intentions and the final outcome. So partition, as we study them, and especially when we're thinking about partition in the Israel-Palestine context, and we're looking at from the vantage point of 1948 and so on, ended up being a system in which of separation of independent sovereign nation states that are separating themselves from an empire that is very quickly collapsing. But this is the post-World War II scenario, which I would argue is actually counterintuitive. That's almost the opposite from the original meaning of partition as it emerged in the 1920s and 30s. And I will try to explain why is that the case. I think that unlike earlier cases of imperial divide and rule, the assumption behind the early partition plans had to do, no one imagined the British Empire would ever disappear. So unlike the partition in India in 1947, India, Pakistan, and in our region that ended up being sort of this quick and dirty exit strategy for the British that were sick and tired and the empire was no longer the main project, in the 1920s and the 30s, partition emerged as a system of maintaining differences within the empire.
Which they had been cultivating already since the late 19th century anyway, since they began ruling some of these. When the British Empire began governing some of these places following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Certainly in Cyprus, we have records that they started categorizing people and, using that as their implicit social divide and rule. So you're saying this is an extension of that?
Well, there's absolutely echoes of these earlier experiences. And you cannot explain the partition of India, you cannot explain the partition of Ireland without looking at the earlier prehistory. For instance, the partition of Ireland is rooted in the earlier settlement of Protestants in Northern Ireland that dates all the way back to the 17th century, and of course to the famous Home Rule debates that color the chronicles of 19th century Irish history, Irish-British history. But the idea behind partition in the 20th century is that you suddenly have periods of imperial anxiety and weaknesses. It's not a coincidence that the Irish Easter Revolt is taking place in 1916 during the war. So there is an assumption that there is sort of a very vocal Republican Party that is using the fact that the British now are weak to demand something to separate, but at the same time, the way to maintain this difference is already versus not only religious terms. I mean, there's something about the way the differences are conceptualized in the 20th century in a more ethno-national language, and not only a religious divide that ends up in that case. And India, in that respect, becomes very interesting.
I'm trying to understand this. Is the central claim of your book that these empires do lead to partition for whatever reason, either unintended consequences or as a tool, or is it actually what they intended gone horribly wrong? Because all of these partitions happened when the empire collapsed. And actually, we know about these empires in ways that, conceptually we think, well, when everybody was living together under the British Empire, actually we had squabbles and struggles, but we managed to keep it together. And now we sort of joke about it and say, oh, well, maybe British should just come back. But I mean...
Right, the imperial nostalgia.
Right, and then if we think about the Soviet system as in empire-like terms, that also we think of as an empire that brought together lots of states, as you put it, into a federal system. So are you trying to make a conceptual or theoretical claim that empires are somehow prone to an outcome of partition ultimately, or that it's their collapse that leads to partition in the wake of their demise?
I will move away from that generalization to a more specific British realm. And I think that this will maybe highlight the differences, in my opinion, from the Soviet case, where you do have a very central sort of a government. You have also a territorial empire. I won't go even into the debate among the Soviet historians whether empire is the best way to describe that system or not.
Of course, they were anti-imperialists.
Fair enough. I'm just saying that they certainly imitated many of the tactics.
Right. So I think that what happened in the British Empire, especially post-World War I, is that you have a very interesting and a solid group of thinkers that imagine that the empire itself is evolving and entering into a new stage. Some of those thinkers were actually using the term the Third Empire. Now, one of the key features of the Third Empire, and this is a key difference from sort of the official Soviet system, is that in this kind of a great commonwealth of nations, each, if you'd like, city-state will govern itself. So self-government is a central part of the project. It's both due to, one would say, noble ideal, liberal ideals about the self-determination of these nations, but it's also much more efficient to run your empire this way. We all know these stories about, the British Raj in India. It's a subcontinent that up until there were troubles in the 20th century, you had 900 civil servants running the entire show. And you have such a major undertaking only by allowing the locals to run their own businesses. Now, in the 20th century, after 1919, self-government is also about preparing these nations for self-government. Self-government, and this is the historian in me says, it's not about independence. It's not about sovereignty. There's no expiry date that comes clear that someone can come and say, I'm mature enough. Give me an independent nation state that is completely separated. And even more than that, the assumption is that in unity, these small fractions cannot uphold themselves without being part of a bigger unity. And I think that this is where the Irish case is very interesting, because unlike what we know about India, Pakistan, and Israel in 1947-8, this is the clear case where partition started as one of those mechanisms of maintaining the differences within the empire. Now, many historians found it difficult to think about Ireland in sort of a colonial in the division among British historians. Ireland is the backyard. The British imperial historians are doing colonies overseas. But actually, you have here something very interesting. And the partition of Ireland in 1922 is actually and the creation of the Free State of Ireland. And this is something that people tend to forget. The Free State of Ireland is a bit of a misnomer. It's a dominion within the British Commonwealth of Nations. So you created a system in which Northern Ireland becomes England per se, and what we think as an independent sovereign republic up to 1949 is actually part of the British Commonwealth of Nations.
Is that almost like a confederation?
The differences between federation and confederations, there are nuances, but they're important nuances. They're thinking, I think, I would argue more federal than confederal, because part of what we see here is a new phase of imperial governing in which you start moving, if you want to use today's language, into sort of a network type of an imagination. In a sense, it's good for you that every unit will run its own business up to, when trouble comes. And I would argue that among so many of these British colonial administrators, World War I, that was devastating and the price was awful, was the proof that the system works. Because suddenly, the empire jumps in to help England in its war. Canadian troops and Australian and people from New Zealand are shedding blood and paying taxes, without which Britain would not succeed. So in a sense, for them, that was already a showcase that this is the way to go.
Going back to the Irish case, another thing that was really central to this whole endeavor was the fact that the separation was meant to bring peace, as it were, like to diffuse the great violence that ushered the process for so many decades. And it was successful to a great extent. I mean, the Irish started killing each other, but the British didn't care about that too much. But in a way, the case was resolved. And so just to finish the question, did this skew or tilt the whole conception of separation? Because that case worked relatively well, people started looking at it as the paradigm and wanted to start and implement it in other places in the world when it was far less compatible. And therefore, we see now so many countries that were partitioned and still don't manage to stand up.
It's a great question. I would add sort of the small qualification is, caveat, of course, is that we have a civil war. We have a very violent and bloody civil war. And this also goes back to my earlier comment that actually the principle of partition was accepted first. And it will take, the British will have to wait until the end of hostilities to have a commission that actually draws the line. So there's a chronological gap, almost 5 years, 4.5 years, between sort of the creation of a border. So the question is, how do you define a successful partition? By taking an internal conflict and internationalizing it, does this make it a successful partition? If you take a conflict between the Muslim and the Hindu population and you create two states, both that have nuclear weapons, and you have one of the, potentially deadliest borders, international borders in the globe, I'm not sure that this would be considered a successful case. But I would add another important historical fact that I think that this is what makes the Irish partition, the early experiment, a slightly different one from both Palestine and India. Shortly after the Irish partition, the British Empire is not in a vacuum. It's responding to international affairs in general. And population exchange or the transfer of population, especially in the Greek-Turkish case, and the Lausanne Agreement becomes part and parcel of that larger imagination. So fast forward from the early 1920s, when everyone is thinking about Ireland, to 10 years later, Palestine, 1936, we have the Great Arab Revolt. The British are sending Lord Peel and his famous commission to think about how to solve exactly, again, violence, anxiety. Suddenly, the empire that we thought will only bring us benefits, we have to send troops to all these places. Suddenly, they're also thinking not only about partition in the Irish sort of a template, they already have a vision of unmixing of populations. Unmixing of population became, and this is what for us today, of course, transfer is a very dirty word, but we have to remember that with the Lausanne Treaty in 1923, the League of Nations in Geneva said this is a kosher way of dealing with differences. And in a similar vein to your earlier question, the Greek-Turkish case was hailed as a very successful conflict resolution type of arrangement.
Well, this is what I want to try to understand. I would like to ask you completely objectively, do you think there is something normatively wrong with partition inherently? And the reason I joke is because reading your book, I get the impression that there is a normative judgment against partition. I'm putting my own feelings about this aside to ask you if that's what you were trying to convey in the book. Because it sounds like you argue that it legitimized a lot of those other tools. That, in other words, partition was raised at that League of Nations time alongside, I'm going to name them because you named them, population exchanges, mass deportation, forcible denationalization, minority rights treaties, and refugee resettlement. Are those inherent to political partition?
I think that by the time we reach World War II and especially the post-war partition became this sort of package deal, as I like to call it. So it's not only about drawing lines on maps It's not only about
partition, so much more.
Yeah, my colleagues are doing the Polish Commonwealth. They're using the term partition, but this is exactly not a partition in the sense that we are talking about.
Yeah, we call it mechitza.
It's about creating new sovereign nation states. So it's about this hyphenated creature we call nation state, which is very important, and about creating a clear majority and potentially ethnic cleansing would be the method of achieving it in that nation state. So this is the package deal. Now, my normative and empirical rhetorical arguments are intermingled in that respect because there is a sort of an assumption, not only among politicians, but sometimes among some political scientists that still consider partition to be empirically sound conflict resolution method. There is an assumption that empirically it worked, that empirically it was successful.
But this is what I want to challenge, because you have one line that sort of encapsulates, I think, the point that I would like to raise, which is you say something like, all other partitions laid the groundwork for future conflict. And I think that what you see in the policy community is that they point to certain examples where that's just not the case. So, for example, the Velvet Divorce, right? Czech Republic and Slovakia, they're not at war now. Serbia and Montenegro separated by referendum, by agreement in 2006. They're not at war now. Now, here's the touchier examples. Sudan and South Sudan are not at war with each other. South Sudan, of course, is embroiled in a terrible civil war. And maybe the most ambiguous example for now would be Kosovo, which is, of course, a partition of Serbia, and they're not at war. The trajectory is to accept that partition. Doesn't look like they're going to go back to war, but it's very complicated because it's not over, obviously. So is it true that all partitions lead to ongoing conflict, or is that a little too categorical?
That's definitely too categorical. I won't go that far, but I would definitely challenge a few of the assumptions in these. The question is, what are the type of entities that emerge out of these partitions? If these are Lilliput states that cannot uphold themselves economically in terms of natural resources, in terms of militarily,
Czech Republic
and then
Slovakia?
they depend on other bigger entities, you actually, pave road often to neo-colonial kind of types of regimes. But this is contemporary affairs. If I will go back to the, maybe the two classic cases, which is Israel-Palestine and India-Pakistan, I think that part of the assumption, and maybe this is where we have a bit of a dialogue with some of the conflict resolution thinkers that assume partition is the best solution, there is a sort of an assumption that partition is it's an act, it's an event in history that finished, maybe like the Israelis like to call it Zbeng v'Gamalnu. It was very violent. It was very cruel. And we have to remember the dimensions, right? We're all familiar with the case of the 1948 war in Palestine and the expulsion of roughly 700,000 Palestinians. That was, in that respect, a war of partition. In order to take the theory and put it into practice, you had to do this. And also the case of Pakistan and India. The numbers are simply breathtaking. We're talking about millions. To this day, we cannot even know the exact number of refugees and people that were forced to leave their houses. We're talking about rapes of roughly 750,000 women. So the violence in that event is quite astonishing. But there's also an assumption that after this, the storm ended, peace reigned the area. And I think that both the case of India, Pakistan, and the case of Israel, Palestine shows exactly, shows too many evidence to the contrary. So in the case of India, it was very clear that partition was an imperfect solution. And for instance, we tend to forget that there was an entity we called East Pakistan. Suddenly you had, again, the partition continued on, and you have Bangladesh, and again, a process of separation that was extremely violent. The divisions that led, to the assassination of Indira Gandhi in 1984, suddenly Indians were saying, we thought that partition is a past deal. It no longer affects our present. And we look at the violence in India today, look at Kashmir, and this is even without looking at our backyard.
Or inward. I mean, in other words, however much you partition, however homogenous your society becomes, which is always a myth anyway, then we will still, I always say if there are 3 people left in a tiny little statelet, they will two of them will turn against the third, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, but the question is whether it's really inherent to the problem of partition, or was these places, I mean, our region and India, Pakistan, just so fucked up in so many ways that no matter what kind of solution you would try to apply to the conflict there, it wouldn't work.
I mean, maybe this is an incidental correlation between, is it correlation or is it causation?
Well, it's a very good question. I think that
Or maybe, and that goes back to my earlier question about whether the British just, spoiled the broth. I mean, I have this, just a short anecdote. I have an English friend who's a professor who is a Middle East historian and comes to the region all the time. And every time she goes into a taxi in Jerusalem, west or east, right, and the driver asks her where she's from, and she says Britain, and they say, oh, it's all your fault then, right? It's just the ongoing legacy of imperialism, whether you like it or not.
Well, we can all say that, look at the world of the map of global conflict, today. And as the joke says, in so many of them, you will see stains of port wine that a British civil servant left as a mark. I mean, yes and no. And I would be cautious in the following respect. The older historiography about partition was sort of, was divided, between these two camps. I mean, all the imperial historians, especially when they were working from the so-called metropole, especially from Britain, and they said, yes, colonialism is bad, but after all, there's also this positive legacy, right? We left law and order and democracy.
And
roads and parliament and trains and so on and so forth. And in all, it's, the violence and all the gruesome facts that come with partition, it's all about this, how could we say it politely? The natives are not so civilized. So on the other hand, so that was sort of the top-down version of partition. They were maybe naive. They were good intentions, but the practice, the local actors had nothing to do with it. Local actors, on this other hand, and this is where partition, it's so difficult both for the Israeli historians and for Indian historians to write about partition. They had, this is the dark side of independence. You prefer telling wonderful stories about the Day of Independence. You don't
Not if you're Salman Rushdie and you write Midnight's Children.
Absolutely. So this is where I think the picture is far more complicated. You do not have simply a top-down process of British civil administrators coming, drawing lines on maps, and then going away. You do have the local actors that are key in turning the idea into fact on the ground. And there's a very interesting process in which, how do you think the local actors start imagining what in the Indian case was called the two nations theory? What is it that pushes someone like Jinnah, the Transnational Muslim League, to decide that, I will think about Muslim differences not through a perspective of maybe a minority treatises within the British Raj, to keep a bigger entity with tolerance and some sort of a constitution and different electors. The older forms of self-government were replaced with a notion that the new name of the game now is nation-state. And this is where I think the partitions as they were originally imagined in the 1920s and 30s and how they were executed after World War I were radically different.
But I want to get back to what I think is another one of the main arguments for the as you put it, the policy people and I guess people with that agenda, the conflict resolution types will claim, which is that is not about the colonial legacy or those natives that just don't know how to manage themselves, but simple cultural distaste. We don't want to live together. We don't like each other, which brings me back to my first question. And again, this is absolutely not my view, but I think it is the prevailing view of people who think that conflict needs to be resolved by separating people. So what I very much appreciated is when you point out that there are other partitions that are not based on that. So you talk about Germany, Korea, and Vietnam as the examples of partitions that show that it's not inevitably based on ethno-nationalism,
Absolutely.
but on historical, political, and economic forces. So can you explain that thesis?
Well, that's absolutely the case. I mean, I think that differences are also culturally constructed. I mean, whether you look at settler colonial cases like the Irish case or the Israel-Palestine case, or if you look at the Indian subcontinent, the differences were something that was cooked slowly through culture. I mean, this is why you will see when those of you will read the collection, you'll see that,
which is all of our listeners,
Of course, you will see that surprisingly, a lot of our authors are dealing with poets, with intellectuals, with novel. I mean, because before you exercise the politics, you need someone to help you to imagine, that the difference. Articulate it. And if you'd like sort of create a wall in the head before there's a wall on the ground, if one would like to do it.
He's looking at me because he knows I wrote my entire PhD about that, basically.
And I think that this is where you see that the German case, for instance, the partition was seen as so foreign, so alien, something that was forced.
Yeah, imposed from outside.
Imposed from the outside. It was, of course, so humiliating that the minute you could, discard it.
Are we able to live together? What are the alternatives to partition for conflict resolution, since you are critical of it?
As historians, I always fear prophesizing. And there's a great George Eliot quote that from all forms of human error, prophecy is the most avoidable one. So I can only say through elimination, I do not see the empirical, historical evidence that will show that partition is such a great solution. So maybe we do need to go back to the sketch.
I would like to have a rhetorical sort of thought to end this on. And that's, I think that we need to take into account that there are examples of coming together of seemingly different cultures into either federated nations or functional unitary states that may have worked for a phase of time, which may be the best we humans can do. In other words, Yugoslavia is an incredibly interesting experiment of bringing together very diverse people, cultures, and religions that stuck around for a short century in two different forms. And that is an incredible feat with all of its flaws and with all of the violence that happened afterwards. So that's one example. Another example is another British, or actually two, which are complicated, example of post-British Empire situations. For example, Tanzania, right? The coming together of Tanganyika and Zanzibar, which is one of the more stable nations in East Africa today. So that is a bit of a counterexample to a post-British Empire partition situation, but quite the opposite. And then, not to open up an entirely new can of worms, but you do mention it, Cyprus, because you point out that it's been de facto partitioned. But I would like to point out in counterpoint that is never the solution. In other words, they haven't been able to reach a solution, but the one solution that nobody wants is full partition there. So we don't necessarily have to assume that everybody sees partition as the solution.
Well, in a sense, Ali, you're going back to ideas that were few of the interwar imperial federalists were thinking about. Even when they were supporting partition, then they were thinking about it as a temporary step on the road to something bigger.
And maybe better.
Mm-hmm.
That's Arie Dubnov, professor of history and Israel studies at George Washington University. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
And thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shalem, our producer. And now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app. We'd like to ask you to please consider writing a review. Just launch the app, select the podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, press write a review, and then the hard part, you have to actually write one. Check out our archive. We have over 450 interviews. If you like our show, you can like us on Facebook, the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel, and follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.